experienced ongoing abductions by alien entities going back to her childhood. During one such encounter, the UFO she was on board was shot down, apparently by the U.S. Air Force, who recovered her from the craft. Leah is author of Lost Was the Key, an account of her abductions by both aliens and apparent military personnel, and most recently, Cito's New Friends, a simple story designed to alleviate fears of young children who are abducted.
John Carpenter didn't cooperate with me. He said, I think that you're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder because you've had some traumatic things, very traumatic things happen to you, but you're not crazy. I denied being hypnotized. I said, well, you know, maybe I wasn't hypnotized. Maybe what I remembered didn't really happen and I imagined it, so I wasn't hypnotized. But my brother said it was obvious that you were. It was quite obvious. I could see the pain you were going through, but I didn't want to accept it. I wanted to deny that these things could happen because they didn't fit in with my reality. You know, I didn't learn about ETs or any other kind of entity in my church, in my school, or anywhere else. So I didn't know how to fit the reality of these things happening into my life. So I chose to deny it for a while. My curiosity far outweighed my fear, and I continued with my hypnosis sessions, and I continued seeking out the answers to the questions of this phenomenon. And as a result, I've met many other abductees. I've met a whole lot of other researchers, and many of them have asked me, you know, why do you feel that you've undergone harassment? Why do you feel that the military and government have singled you out like this? A lot of researchers and abductees say that they have not encountered military government harassment in their cases or in other cases. So why have I? Well, one possible explanation is that I was involved in a crash of a spaceship. I remember
AFS Dialogue presents a presentation by Mark Davenport. Mark Davenport has been a lifelong student of the UFO phenomenon. A former manufacturing engineer, he is author of Visitors from Time, The Secret of the UFOs, and editor of the bi-monthly publication Contact Forum, the Roundtable of Universal Communication. Mark explains a fascinating hypothesis that begins to unravel the many enigmas that have baffled UFO investigators for decades.
My hypothesis is that these people who are driving these UFOs, or at least the people who designed them, have a technology that's more advanced than ours. I mean, I think that's obvious, that they're more advanced than our technology. Their technology is so advanced that they have figured out a way to artificially warp space-time the way a black hole does, only without all the gravitational effects that rip things apart into their constituent atoms, so that they can actually manipulate. They have some sort of a generator in here so that they can actually produce this field around their craft like a little bubble, a little private universe that they carry around with them, so that they can actually step out of normal space-time into their own private universe and then step back into it at other coordinates. So if that's possible, then they can not only come from all these distant places, but they can also come from parallel universes that coexist with ours and we're not able to see because they're on a different vibrational level or whatever. They can even come, probably, from our own past or our own future. Because as the quantum physicists are telling us now, the past, present, and future are not separate. Our idea of the stream of time is only an artifact of our consciousness. It is our consciousness that's traveling. It isn't that things are happening, cause and effect, in a linear fashion. It is our consciousness that's doing that. So the past and future actually exist simultaneously with us, and if you're able to warp space-time, you can travel to and from them. Time is not linear. In fact, it doesn't exist. It's just a concept that we use to describe aspects of space-time, and it's an artifact of our consciousness. I got involved in studying UFOs. Actually, I literally cut my teeth on flying saucers. My parents always had Fate magazines around the house, and I actually learned to reading a story about, at that time we called them flying saucers, in Fate magazine when I was 4 years old. The reason for that is my dad, during World War II, since he was an electronics engineer, the Army had him loading bombs in England. And he got to talk to the pilots and the gunners and stuff, and he saw these Foo Fighters, and that's when he got interested. And he and my mother always had studied ancient religions and stuff anyway, and they had both seen UFOs in the past, and so they were always interested in it, and so it was always around.
Where did you grow up in?
In Joplin, Missouri, and spent my first 30-some years there. And so it was always around. I have a legitimate excuse for being interested in it, very interested in it. However, let me say that the more involved I am in this subject, the more I tend to think that some or all ufologists, most or all ufologists have probably been contacted in some way at some point during their lives. A few of them have now admitted it. Ray Fowler, for instance, has admitted that he's an abductee. Leo Sprinkle, I think. Some of the others don't come. Well, Richard Boylan, Carla Turner. That's why she got into the business in the first place.
Right.
And there are a number who I think know that they are, but they don't want to admit it. And I suspect that I may be, simply because of my extreme interest in the subject. And then, of course, you always put together these little things that happen here and there, and you think back and say, now, was that really missing time I had, And the more you're involved in the subject, the more it tends to make you think, well, maybe there was something there. Why did I spend all of the hours I spent writing this book if there wasn't something behind it? You know? So, but I was a man.
So from when you were young, like from when you were 5 years old, you had an interest in the subject?
Well, like I said, it was always there.
Yeah.
Magazines lying around the house all the time with the flying saucers, and Daddy, what's this? Well, nobody knows, and it's an intriguing thing to a kid. Even my dad doesn't know what these things are. And so I was always intrigued by it. Then when I was about 10 or 11, I saw an anomalous object of some sort. It was a silver cigar-shaped thing, way up in the sky, too far away to tell what it was, but it was hanging there, motionless, so it wasn't an aircraft. I mean, it didn't appear to be. It could have been a blimp. In fact, I thought it was the Goodyear blimp, and I rode my bicycle home and said, Dad, I saw the Goodyear blimp, and he said, no, I don't think so. That's in another state, several states away right now. As a matter of fact, he called the airport to check and see if there were any blimps in flight plans, and there weren't. So whatever I saw with a friend of mine, there were 2 witnesses. It was enough to keep me interested in it. Incidentally, the other witness is now a nuclear physicist working on quantum physics, and he's a professor of physics. And he and I have had some interesting conversations about the speed of light limit and the Lorentz equations and so forth.
Yeah, interesting connection. So, and then you write too in your book about a case that you investigated. How old were you at that point?
Oh, the case in near my home where that would have been about 1973, I believe, in that area. There was a farmer who he had told the sheriff about his sighting because he thought it might be something important. And when we went to investigate, this was the first time I'd actually done an on-site investigation at a landing site and so forth. And this gentleman did not want anyone around there. He wished he'd never mentioned it to the sheriff.
Oh, yeah.
He only mentioned it because he thought it might be something important, and he felt like it was his duty to do so.
Mm-hmm.
He did not want anyone around there degrading his fence and spooking his livestock and so forth. And he's a very nice gentleman. He did talk to me for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But he told me, he said, I've got to get back to work and you're going to have to leave. And But he told me this story about this silver thing. He'd come out of his house and he'd seen this thing in his pasture, I'd guess maybe 150 feet from where he stepped out of his door.
Mm-hmm.
And it was early in the morning. He was going to do his chores and feed the hogs and everything. And he thought at the time maybe it was a tarpaulin that had blown there or a fuel tank that had fallen off an aircraft or something like that. And he made a mental note that he'd get it out of his pasture so that it wouldn't take up the space and so forth. But he's going to go do his chores first. So he did that, and then he came back with a tractor. He was going to drag this thing away. And before he got to within 100 feet of this thing, it rose up and hovered, and he got a very good look at it. And it was just a silver saucer, 25, 30 feet in diameter, 50 feet off the ground, hovering. And then he stood there and watched it for a while, and then it just took off instantly, and it went up, and it merged with a silver cigar-shaped thing.
Oh, okay.
His description was identical to what I'd seen when I was 10 years old.
Mm.
He hadn't seen that before until this saucer went up and merged with it, and then they took off. Mm. Now, this guy was absolutely honest and trustworthy. I mean, there are certain people that you meet that you just know they're telling you the truth. He thought it was a sin to tell a lie. He probably never had told a lie in his life. He didn't touch booze. He didn't, he was just a very straight-laced person, and he had no reason to report this. In fact, he was very definite. Don't tell anyone where I am. I don't want any publicity about this. And he convinced me. I mean, I was just a kid at the time. It's been 20 years ago, but he convinced me. And from that point, I was really hooked on this mystery. And I determined that I was going to find out what it was.
Okay. So let's take it farther. I forgot. How old were you at that point?
Well, that was 1973, and
Okay.
I'm 41 now, so I guess I would have been 21 then.
Yeah. So
And-
from there, your interest continued.
Yes. And I
as an
studied.
active research, involved in researching, or
Yeah, I
reading,
got more active into doing primary research. Of course, I also read all the books and magazines that I could find, and interviewed all my friends and neighbors and relatives about their sightings. I don't know how many, maybe 1 out of 10 people you meet has seen a UFO, and they all like to talk about them, usually, but only to someone they trust and someone they know who won't say, who won't tell the media and everything like that. So I started that way, and interviewing people I knew, and whenever there was a sighting in the area, I'd go check it out and do what I could to investigate it. And there were quite a few sightings in our area. Then I became a manufacturing engineer and learned techniques of problem solving. When a production line is running and something breaks, you have to fix it one way or another. You either have to repair that machine, do some kind of jury rig, or get a new machine, or redesign the product so that you don't need to use the machine. You have to do something and look at it from all different angles until you find the optimum solution. And so I applied those methods to the UFO mystery, and that's what my book is about. Because almost immediately I found what I thought were inconsistencies in the methods that ufologists were using. And this is why I thought, this was in the 70s, people had been studying these things for 30 years and really hadn't come up with any good answers. I mean, we had the Marjorie Fish map of Betty Hill's star map that she'd been shown. And we thought maybe some of these guys came from the reticulum system. And that explains some things, but it didn't explain how people like George Adamski could believe that they had been taken to the moon and saw jungles there.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't explain the spiritual and the metaphysical aspects of UFOs. It didn't explain why they came more often on Wednesdays than other days, and on the 24th of the month more often, and in July and September more often than other months, and so on. There was a whole lot of stuff. It didn't explain how they were able to travel at 40,000 miles an hour right through the atmosphere without causing any noise, without breaking up, disintegrating, how they could do 180-degree instantaneous turns and disappear and change shape and all these magical things. And yet, we knew that these things, even though they appeared not to be physical, they could become physical. They could come down and land. They could do a 180-degree turn at 6,000 miles an hour and then come down and land and press holes in the ground, set the pavement on fire, burn the grass, as they did at this landing site that I'd seen. There wasn't any grass left there. It was all scorched. And people can come up and wrap their knuckles on them and be taken inside them and have operations done on them. In other words, they're physical things. They break the tree branches when they take off. But they do things that physical things can't do. And so this, if they're from another planet, that doesn't explain. If they're spacecraft, that have rocketed here from this other planet, how can they do all these magical things?
You mean if they're within our
normal
3 or 4-dimensional realities?
Yeah.
Or within the paradigm of our science?
Exactly. Yeah. And so I was looking at the methods that ufologists were using. Dr. Hynek said that the repeater aspects, I can't remember exactly how he worded it, but what it amounted to was that in the study that he was doing at the time, he was not going to consider repeaters, in other words, people who had seen more than one UFO. Well, that let me out. I couldn't testify for him, and it let most of the good evidence out, I think.
What was his logic there?
Well, I think he was assuming that if someone saw them more than once, then it was probably imaginary. There was something wrong with the witness, so he wasn't going to look at those. Today, we still have that kind of a mindset. People make up their minds ahead of time what they think they ought to be, and then when they go to study them, they only study that portion of the data. Some people, for years and years, no one would study the actual landings. They believed that these things were from another planet and that they were buzzing around in the skies, but they would not believe that they could land. And then even the ones who believed that they could land and they'd study landings, they wouldn't study abduction cases. They'd say, well, it must be psychological, it must be in your mind. So even though they believed that they could land and that they were from another planet, they did not believe that they could come and take us and do things with us. It's a denial process, the way I see it. And this denial process is still in effect.
So we're being led sort of into more acceptance by, for example, first of all, are there physical craft here? Yes, obviously. Second, is there intelligence behind the craft? Well, there can't be. I mean, you know what I mean? Yeah. Each one is completely illogical, yet it's almost like a step to acceptance of the reality.
Exactly, yeah.
Where's it leading then, in your estimation?
Well, I'll tell you in just a second. Let me mention a couple of things first. One is the curious idea that any piece of metal or anything else that's found in the vicinity of a UFO, when it's analyzed, if it's not something exotic, in other words, something that couldn't possibly have been manufactured on the Earth, then it's assumed that it's a hoax. Now, where does that assumption come? Does that mean that on some planet around Zeta 1 Reticuli, that they can't possibly manufacture things the same way we do here, out of the same materials? Or does it mean, what does it mean? A great many researchers will not consider anecdotal data if it comes from a child, an alcoholic, someone who has ever been to a psychiatrist, a drug addict, anybody else who is the least bit suspect as a witness. We throw out all that evidence. And so when you combine all these things together, you combine the UFO buffs, you can't listen to them. You can't listen to people who are very interested in UFOs or who have seen them more than once. Throw that out. Throw it out if they drink, you know. Throw it out if they're involved in some offbeat religion. Throw that out. Throw it out if it's not exotic enough material that you find. You're throwing the baby away with the bathwater. In trying to separate the signal from the noise, you're throwing away the square-sided pieces of that jigsaw puzzle. That's what I saw when I looked at this. And you ask, where are we with this now? We've made a lot of progress over the years. A lot of people now acknowledge that these things do exist, that they are visiting us, and that they are interacting with us, and even abducting people on a large scale, and changing things in their minds, and changing things in their bodies, and so forth. Maybe we can speculate later about why. Where we are now, though, is recently Donald Ware was just asked to leave the board of directors of the largest organization, the Mutual UFO Network, of which I'm a member, and a lot of people are, because he was trying to convince the board members that spirituality and the channeling that's going on is a proper area for scientific study. And they were tired of hearing this, and so they got rid of him. And it's the same type of thing, in my opinion. Denial. Why not look at the evidence? They don't want to look at that portion of the evidence. So we're still in the same mode. And we've made a lot of progress, but we just haven't got all the way there yet, I think.
There's been a lot of debate about the value of various methods of telepathic communication, channeling being the one I hear badmouthed a lot. But I look at the reading of information, regardless of what source it is, as to how much wisdom I discern in that information. And I know that a lot of information written by human beings is a lot more useful than other information written by human beings. I think the same is true for those who have graduated beyond the human state, those that are communicating with us through various telepathic processes. I think telepathy can be used in causing people to hear hums in their head, to hear voices in their head, like many people who see UFOs, like Ed Walters did, and a number of other cases that I have investigated. I think telepathy is used in some part of the operation of a Ouija board. I think it's used in the deep trance channeling process that some of the more famous channelers do. The light trance channeling that others acquire books through is having a major impact on society right now. There are so many books that are written where an individual is used as a channel by a higher intelligence to provide that information. The many books that Alice Bailey wrote, 80, 90 years ago, I think have made a major impact on a lot of people that shows there's so much wisdom in that stuff, in my view, that one little book written by Alice Bailey gives you more information that's useful than a great big book written by 2 or 3 other people, human being types. Right now, there are a number of good books on the market that are designed to help us through this transformational process. And this is one of them that I've recently read, called Preparing for Contact. And this is a Royal Priest research book, one that where the information is acquired through Lisa Royal, who is a full trance channel at the time. Keith Priest is a questioner in many of these conversations. But I think if people are interested in knowing more about the contacts that we're having with higher intelligence, whether they be alien folks or more spiritually oriented intelligence interacting with us, then this book is the right book for now, 1994.
You know, it's interesting. Sometime in our past, I don't know when it was, sometime during the Renaissance period, somebody decided that we're going to separate man into two pieces. We're going to leave the spirituality behind, and we're going to take the science. We're going to make this be science. And if we can't put it in a jar and prove it and put it on a shelf and label it and keep going back and testing it, then it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So what they have done is they've separated our soul from the rest of us. And we've been living that way in a soulless society for so long now that people are convinced, our scientists are convinced, a lot of them, that there is no soul, that there is no... And as the metaphysicians will tell you, that's the biggest part of us. This physical, three-dimensional part of us is the smallest part of us. And I think this phenomenon is making it clear to us once again that that's something that we can't escape, that it does exist. And my hypothesis is that these UFOs, not the misperceptions of common objects, of airplanes and weather balloons and all that stuff. Take all that stuff out, the hoaxes and the hallucinations, things that you can obviously take out. And what you're left with is real, unidentifiable flying objects, craft from somewhere. My hypothesis is that, I'll give you a little physics here now. Einstein said back in 1905 that space and time are interdependent, and together they form a four-dimensional continuum that we call space-time. The presence of matter warps the space-time continuum. The greater the mass, the greater the curvature. There's more warping around the sun than there is around the Earth because the sun is heavier, more massive. If the mass is great enough in what we call a black hole, the space-time continuum can actually be warped inside out so that time actually runs backwards there. Time is not really a thing. It's an abstract idea that we use to describe aspects of space-time. My hypothesis is that these people who are driving these UFOs, or at least the people who designed them, have a technology that's more advanced than ours. I mean, I think that's obvious, that they're more advanced than our technology. Their technology is so advanced that they have figured out a way to artificially warp space-time the way a black hole does, only without all the gravitational effects that rip things apart into their constituent atoms. So that they can actually manipulate. They have some sort of a generator in here so that they can actually produce this field around their craft like a little bubble, a little private universe that they carry around with them, so that they can actually step out of normal space-time into their own private universe and then step back into it at other coordinates. And I believe some of them may not do this technologically. Some of them may do it telekinetically. They may do it directly with the power of their mind.
So they're not using any technology.
They're not actually using the machine, but the result is the same. I mean, people have a tendency to set up something that's supernatural as being opposite of something that's super technological, and I don't really think there's any. The only difference is the method that you use to get to the same place. So the people who told us about, like Richard Thomas at the Las Vegas convention, he talked about, or was it Richard Thompson, talked about the Vedas, the ancient Indian books about these beings who could travel through walls and do remote viewing and travel through time and so forth. They're doing all the same things that we see the UFOs doing today. Apparently maybe they didn't have any technology. Maybe they did it directly with their minds. I don't think the distinction is really as important as people think. But anyway, the fact that UFOs are able to warp space-time may mean that they can travel almost instantaneously to and from other planets, other stars, other galaxies. There's really no limit. If they're able to do this, and they're able to create a private little wormhole, we'll call it a wormhole, that's what the leading cosmologists refer to it as, there's really no limit as to how far they can go, because they're not traveling through the intervening space at all. They're warping it and going around it.
So a wormhole, all that's doing is creating essentially a tunnel with a linear concept of time being warped around it? So that
You
they're
can think of it
outside
that
of
way.
those concepts?
You can think of it that way.
I mean, you have to always imagine time as being a physical thing at that point, though, that is manipulated.
Yeah, but
That's
see,
a
our
hard
minds,
concept, too.
our minds are linear, and they
Yeah.
want to work on a linear fashion. We want to think of time as a river that flows inexorably from the past through the present into the future, and we're like corks in that river,
Yeah.
and we don't have any choice about where we're going. The people aboard these craft who have taken people aboard them and taught them things about time tell them, several people that I've talked to, they said, we've been told that time is not linear. It's no more, they told Leah Haley, for instance, time is no more linear than the earth is flat. They described it to her in terms of a slinky, a child's toy that's like a coil. Time's like a slinky, and it has all these coils. So, and then there are parallel universes, so there can be several slinkies all stuck together and wound all around each other. So that you can, there are places, nodes, where they touch, and you can step outside one and into the other. So if that's possible, then they can not only come from all these distant places, but they can also come from parallel universes that coexist with ours and we're not able to see because they're on a different vibrational level or whatever. They can even come, probably, from our own past or our own future. Because as the quantum physicists are telling us now, the past, present, and future are not separate. Our idea of the stream of time is only an artifact of our consciousness. It is our consciousness that's traveling. It isn't that things are happening cause and effect in a linear fashion. It is our consciousness that's doing that. So the past and future actually exist simultaneously with us, and if you're able to warp space-time, you can travel to and from them. They may also be able to travel to and from the place where we go when we dream or when we die. We just don't know how many dimensions there are that you could actually travel to if you could do this.
I think it's very interesting what they told me about time. They told me that time is no more linear than the earth is flat. They said time is like a slinky, the child's spring toy. And they told me that time can be bent, it can be stretched, it can be contracted, and it can even be overlapped. They told me that because of this, the choices that we make today can affect not only our future, but whether or not certain aspects of our past ever occurred. And they told me that actually time as we know it is totally non-existent, that it's really space that's important, not time as we know it. And then this silent voice communicator expanded this concept of time in another telepathic communication I received in April 1993. What it told me this time was that there's really more than one dimension. In other words, there's more than one slinky. And these slinkies or these dimensions can intersect or they can even overlap. And they told me that that sometimes is why there's an inconsistency in an abductee being away from what he considers a certain amount of time, but maybe it seems like more or less. For example, if an abductee is taken out of his dimension at a certain point where another dimension intersects and taken into a different dimension where these alien medical experiments take place, perhaps in the environment where his abduction takes place, his medical experiments with the aliens, well, maybe 60 minutes has passed by there, and he's brought back into his original dimension, and maybe only 20 minutes have passed there. And it's because if you think of two slinkies, maybe loops can be bigger in one than the other. In other words, maybe a time loop can be larger in one dimension than in another dimension. And it's very difficult for us to understand this concept because we think of it in terms of linearity, but it's not.
And I think that we can do this someday. In fact, there are rumors that we have figured out how to do this. The Philadelphia experiment, for instance,
infamous.
The infamous.
Yeah.
According to Al Bielek and Preston Nichols and several other people, in 1943, when the Navy tried to make the USS Eldridge invisible to radar, it disappeared and went somewhere, and they didn't know where. Later, according to these people, they found out that it went to Montauk, New York, where there was another experiment in progress. They had inadvertently created a wormhole between 1943 and 1983, according to Bielek, and the entire ship went there. And then as soon as they realized what had happened, they took steps to bring it back, because otherwise, if you just leave a wormhole open, God only knows what could happen. I mean, it could swallow up the whole Earth. You know, they didn't know what would happen, and I don't think they still do. But anyway, according to these people, that was when we first learned that we could do this. And according to them, our government, certain elements of our government are doing it now, and have been for many years.
They were trying at that point. The project in '83 was running awry. Mm-hmm. And they were trying to shut it down, but they realized it was locked in to the generators, the equipment on the boat. Mm-hmm. So somebody, we believe it was Duncan here, had to go back to the boat and smash all the generators. Al Bielek, of course, believes he was in on it. We don't know for sure. Mm-hmm. Somebody went back, smashed the generators. When the generators were smashed and the Rainbow shut down, mm-hmm. the Rainbow project was stopped, then Montauk stopped, Philadelphia stopped, mm-hmm. the piece of the Montauk underground that was floating in hyperspace returned to its rightful mm-hmm. area, the Eldridge returned to Philadelphia Harbor, and all of a sudden, there it was in the Philadelphia Harbor again. Mm-hmm. Of course, they couldn't raise the Eldridge. They couldn't get anybody on the radio. Mm-hmm. You know, they would get a carrier a couple of times, but they weren't able to get anything that made any sense from the Eldridge, so they sent a launch out to the Eldridge to find out what happened, of course. Mm-hmm. And what they found is they found people wandering aimlessly around the deck of the ship. Mm-hmm. They found some people actually integrated into the deck of the ship with arms in, maybe a shoulder and a head sticking out. Wow. In other words, when the thing transitioned into hyperspace, if you moved, everything became energetic. It means you could move through that wall. If when it came back and was solid, if you were in that wall, you became part of that wall. Mm-hmm. Because Tom Bearden talks of this theory and concept quite heavily. Mm-hmm. You know, about putting the pencil through a piece of metal and having it be integrated into the piece of metal. Mm-hmm. You know, that's been a famous accidental experiment that was done years ago that still nobody knows how to do at this point. But either way, the Navy saw, yes, the experiment worked. Mm-hmm. It was a tremendous success, but it also literally destroyed the mind of the men on the ship. Mm-hmm. So it was a success, but it was also a failure.
That's very controversial information, you know. It's very difficult to prove. These people are the first to tell you that all their memories are suspect because they have been brainwashed.
And Preston talks about living two timelines,
exactly.
Two parallel timelines, so they had two separate consciousnesses occurring at the same time.
And we've been finding that that's happening with some of these abductees.
Yeah.
Some of them have been living simultaneous timelines, and some of them have been in what do I want to say? Every so often, intermittently, they will have these little scenarios happen to them where they live in two or three separate timelines just for short periods of time. Now, the way that some of the abductees have explained that to me, they say, Michelle Levine, for instance, says, they pick me up on a Monday, they keep me till Friday, I work with them all week. They're teaching her stuff. They bring me back on a Monday, a half an hour before they pick me up. Then they pick me up on a Tuesday and keep me till Thursday and bring me back on a Tuesday half an hour after they pick me up. She says, there's two of me during this time. It's almost impossible for us to understand this because our minds want to work linearly. But all of these euphonauts, if you want to call them that, all of them are telling people that time is not linear. They tell us we're stuck in time. For years and years and years, they've been asking people, what is time? What is a year? What is age? What time is it? We don't have much time. We have to return. We'll return in time. It's like they're obsessed with this idea of time when they're trying to talk to people, and it just doesn't get across to us because we think in terms of linear time. Time is not linear. In fact, it doesn't exist. It's just a concept that we use to describe aspects of space-time, and it's an artifact of our consciousness. So this warping of space-time, I think, can explain a great many things about the UFOs. How they're able to travel at thousands of miles an hour without breaking up. They're not really traveling that fast through the atmosphere because they're not in normal space-time. They're inside this little private universe, and the laws of physics are different. There's a barrier between them and us, and the laws of physics do not cross that barrier. It explains how they're able to disappear, because there could be a UFO right in front of you, and if it's inside this bubble, this own private universe, it's possible that you could see light coming through that barrier, but even if you do see light coming through, it's probably going to be affected by the barrier. There's going to be a Doppler effect. Doppler effect. If you're at a racetrack and the car's coming toward you and it's a high-pitched sound, and just as it passes you and goes the other way, it suddenly changes to a low-pitched sound, because the sound is propagated in sinusoidal waves like this, just like waves on an ocean, and the distance between the peaks and valleys of each wave determines the pitch of the sound. When an object's coming toward you, it emits one wave, and then it travels a little bit before it emits the next wave, and that has the effect of condensing those waves and making the peaks and valleys closer together, and that's what raises the pitch. As it goes away, the opposite is true. It emits one wave, it travels a little bit, it emits the next wave. And so those peaks are stretched out, and that's why the sound is lower. It's the same thing with any electromagnetic radiation. It's also in sinusoidal waves. And this includes radio waves, heat, light, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, the whole gamut of electromagnetic radiations. They are all identical. You can't tell them from one another except the frequency. The wavelength is the only thing that's different. Radio waves can be thousands of miles between peaks. On the other end of the spectrum, gamma rays, there can be trillions of them in an inch. So they're much higher energy. But they're exactly the same otherwise. It's like the metaphysicians have been telling us. There are different vibrations. And so when we see this, when we look at our universe that we're in, our three-dimensional universe, we think that each one of those is a separate thing, those waves. But they're really not. It's just that one of them is higher energy than the other. If these UFOs are indeed surrounded by this field that warps time, that warps space-time, and they emit any kind of electromagnetic radiation, as it passes through the barrier of that field, it's liable to be Dopplered, to have a Doppler effect, so that, let's say it starts out as heat. As it comes through the field, the wavelength is compressed. It becomes higher energy as it goes through that barrier, as it goes through that field, and it's Dopplered into light, which is the next higher thing on the next higher energy wavelength on the electromagnetic spectrum. So we're seeing an image, but it may not be the image that's actually there. What we're seeing is the heat. Okay, so that, to me, that explains why these things are able to change shape, why one time they look like one thing, another time they look like another thing, why a person who's close to them sees something different than a person who's far away. A person who photographs them gets a different picture than what they saw with their eyes, because, film is sensitive to different wavelengths of radiation than our eyes are. For instance, ultraviolet, X-rays, other things can affect film and not our eyes. It explains to me why radar sometimes can pick these things up and sometimes can't. Imagine a radar signal, which is nothing but a radio wave. It goes through this field, and as it goes through it, it's Dopplered into some other frequency. If it then bounces off the hull of the ship, it probably doesn't have a transponder like our airplanes do. If it bounces off the hull, when it comes back through the field, it's Dopplered again. It may arrive back at the source before it ever left. There may be a time warp there. Or it may be an entirely different frequency and the radar can't pick it up. So to me, it explains so many things, and I could go on and on and on.
Yeah.
Imagine, anything that you've thought of as a mystery, an enigma, that these UFOs seem to do magic things, and imagine that, and then compare it with the idea that they can warp space-time, and it becomes easy. They can go through walls, solid walls, they can take people through, and well, if they can warp space-time, the wall doesn't have to exist there at the time they're going through it. It explains why, to me, why cars stop. You're driving along a backcountry road in the middle of the night, and you see this light, and it comes down and looks kind of weird to you, and you get a little worried about it, and it gets closer, and you're really worried about it now, and then your engine starts to cough, and your headlights start to dim, and this thing comes and lands in the road in front of you, and before you know what's happened, your whole car is dead. There's no power. The radio's off, the lights don't work, everything. And you can't start it. There's nothing you can do. So you're sitting there with your mouth open looking at this thing, and then it leaves. Maybe in the meantime you're abducted, I don't know. But it leaves, and your car starts running again by itself. The radio comes back on, the headlights come back on, and if you have it in gear, it may even start going down the road again by itself. In the past, people have said, well, these things are just big magnets, and the reason they're spinning is so they won't flip over, and they're traveling on the Earth's lines of magnetic force, and it's an electromagnetic effect, and that's what's causing your car to do this. But if that's the case, how does the car start up by itself? We also have,
in a sense, remain running.
Yes.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you're warping space-time and you've got time virtually stopped in that field, and the field comes and contacts your car, maybe it isn't that the car is electromagnetically suppressed. Maybe it just is slowed down to the point where the electricity isn't running through the wires. I mean, it has to be, everything has to be just right for the thing to work. And we have, if it is an electromagnetic effect, they figured out that, first of all, the metal and the sheet metal in the car would actually be bent by something strong enough to do that. It would blow up radios. I mean, it would just fry integrated circuits, field effect transistors and stuff like that. It would just pop them. And it would leave residual magnetic signatures in the car. You'd be able to tell. You could come up with a magnetometer and instantly tell that this thing's been subjected to a tremendous magnetic field. We haven't found any of those things. It also happens with power failures. UFO flies over, all the lights go out in the city. You saw this in Close Encounters. That was based on fact. It's happened many times. How does that happen? Well, they say, well, it's a magnetic anomaly that's causing it. But then some of the power grid systems are designed so that once they go off, they have to be restarted manually at various different places. Nevertheless, they come on by themselves. So apparently they never were off. And yet there are no lights. There is no electricity. So what happened? Well, if that field, warp space-time, gets in contact with the wires, maybe the electricity simply isn't flowing fast enough to have any effect. And then when the field disappears, when the UFO flies away, it starts flowing again. It doesn't burn up the fuses and circuits like it would if someone had just turned it off and then turned it all back on at once. It's happened also with other equipment. This oil pumping equipment in Kuwait, which is automatic equipment designed for safety reasons so that once it turns off, technicians have to come and restart it. There's a restarting procedure that's very complicated that they have to go through. Nevertheless, a UFO flew over some of that equipment. It went off, the pumps stopped running. As the UFO passed away and left, the pumps came on again by themselves. No one could figure out why. We have documentation of that from the American Embassy. They reported that back to the States.
Recently, or
No, this was a long time before Desert Storm. I think it was back in, I want to say 73, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
But it was a long time before that, when we were more friendly with people in that area.
Yeah.
But this sort of thing has been documented many times. Another thing that's been documented many times is that when people go inside these craft, they find out that they're much larger on the inside than they are on the outside.
Yeah.
There's one case where a guy said this was a captured craft. So he was not in an altered state. He was not taken unconsciously. He was a soldier, and his job was to photograph things. And they took him, I believe it was Edwards Air Force Base. Again, I'm not sure about that. They took him to photograph this thing. He saw it on the outside. He said maybe it was 30 feet in diameter, a classic saucer. And he got up in the thing and looked inside, and he said it was so big on the inside that he could have thrown a football across it and not hit the other side. Now, this is common. I've talked to many people who say they've been abducted and taken aboard these things, and they say the thing landed in my backyard, and then when they get inside it, they'll say, well, we went up the stairs to this other level, and we went in all these big rooms, and there was, it just doesn't, it isn't right. There's something wrong. I think the reason is this thing is not in normal space-time. It actually is much larger than it looks, because when you see it from the outside, you're not seeing something in normal space-time. You're seeing it through the field. Okay, so there have been cases where people say that they were trying to run away from one of these things, and it was north of them, so they ran south, and they kept getting closer to it. And they couldn't figure out what was wrong. See, even direction has changed. Because, they're trying to run away, and they're getting closer. The ordinary laws of physics, the ordinary laws of space-time don't apply. I'm sure you've heard many cases of people who had a close encounter, and all ambient sounds disappeared. They couldn't hear the crickets anymore. They couldn't hear the wind. There were no cows mooing. The automobile sounds on the road disappeared. There was nothing. I think in the vicinity of these UFOs, there's this field around them, and I think it affects everything. It could Doppler the sound out of the audible range easily. Sound is more easily Dopplered than electromagnetics are. Or it could simply change the laws of physics to where sound doesn't work anymore. A lot of people have said that their voices are distorted when they speak and they're close to one of these craft or inside it. Their voice sounds odd to them. It sounds high, shrill. A lot of people have said when they meet these beings and the beings talk to them, they talk in a high sing-song fashion like a speeded-up phonograph record. I think it could also be effects of this same field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, I appreciate that you've actually looked at all the data and given it some thought, because, you can read a lot of, you know the literature. Nobody's really done a synthesis of what's occurring.
Yeah, that's one of the other problems I found when I first started looking at the methods that ufologists were using.
Yeah.
One of the methods that they have is to go out and gather all the raw data that they possibly can. Well, we now have mountains and mountains of raw data, and hardly anybody has done any analysis of it. Mm-hmm. They have sat and said, well, I think these guys are from somewhere else because they don't appear to be from here. And a lot of them, that's as far as they've ever gone. They've never really analyzed the data. A few people have, Jacques Vallée, Alan Hendry, a few people have done some deep statistical studies of a lot of sightings and stuff. And I use some of those in my book to show that there are patterns. One of the patterns is that the UFOs themselves seem to change color when they change direction. If they're going at high speed and they suddenly make a hairpin turn. If it's dark enough to see, you can see that the color changes maybe from green to red or something like that. And I think, that, again, that's probably an indication. What you're seeing is, as they change, as they vary the size and shape and strength of that field around them, you're seeing different amount of Doppler effect.
So the light waves are varying, so the color is changing in relation to the visual.
Color, all it is a change in frequency of light.
Yeah.
You know, red light is a certain frequency, orange light is a slightly higher frequency, yellow is a slightly higher yet, and there are all sorts of variations in between. It's interesting because a lot of people who have close encounters describe all of those colors and other colors that they can't describe. You say, well, what color is it? Well, I can't describe it. Well, why not? Well, I've never seen it before.
So these could be colors outside of our visible spectrum.
Colors that do not exist in nature.
Yeah.
And the reason is because they're not in nature. They're not in normal space-time. They can exist in other space-times, but not in ours. Not in the universe, the three-dimensional universe that we live in. Mm-hmm. At least that's my hypothesis. I keep saying that. I don't want to say that this is a fact. I can't establish that it's a fact. But that's my take on it.
Well, you know, that's the curious thing about this whole thing is that I think that I'm not sure that it can ever be established as fact as we understand it within the paradigm that we exist and accept. You know what I mean? The limitations with which our physics operate. Mm-hmm. These things, it's a whole new science. It's a whole new consciousness. It's a, you know what I mean? That's the difficulty. In my mind, we're never going to solve it without. But how do we get there? You know, is there a natural way to go from here to there?
I understand what you're saying. I do believe that we can understand it, and I do believe that we can prove it with ordinary scientific methods that we use for other things. I think it'll be similar to when, you know, people used to say 100 years ago, the top scientists in the world said there can be no such things as meteors because everybody knows no stones can fall from the sky because there are no stones in the sky. Well, later on when we learned more, we learned that there are stones in the sky. It's just that they're not in our atmosphere until they hit it and then they fall to Earth, meteors. So I think it will probably be the same thing. When we learn more about the universe, we will figure all this stuff out. On the other hand, if we are to believe what the people in these saucers are telling us, we are changing. Not only the Earth and us and everything on it is changing, but the entire universe is changing. And we are subjected to a wave of energy coming from the center of the universe. And most of them describe it as it is increasing our vibrational rate, so that we're going to be subjected to a different universe than we live in now. It's changing, and we have nobody has any control over it. And when that happens, we're going to find it easier ourselves to travel into the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th dimension, or density, or Ra calls it Ra, the raw material, calls it density, I think. 4th density, 5th density, and so forth. If we're to believe that stuff, then we're going to find out, even if we don't seek the answers, because we're going to be part of it. And I think that could be true. I don't know.
So that, I mean, yes. I mean, what you're talking now is more of the New Age aspect of the whole phenomenon.
I think we are all, you could either call us victims of the New Age or beneficiaries of the New Age, or whatever you want to call it. The New Age is here.
In that sense, though, we're not in control of our consciousness at all, if that's the case. Because our awareness is being given to us from a source outside of ourselves.
Well, now that's
not good or bad.
That's not the way I interpreted it. The way I interpreted it is, we are in control of our consciousness, but our consciousness is affected by this wave of energy from the center of the universe that's coming, and it's going to affect all of us. Not only us, but other people in other dimensions, other planets, everything.
You're going to have a problem with scientists when you start.
Well, that's true. But as I said, I think metaphysics and physics and ufology are all coming together very quickly. It's happening. To me, I can see it happening very quickly. We have scientists who are saying, these things are real. They've been real all along. And my quantum physics tells me right here that there are parallel universes, and it explains why. George Adamski could have been taken to the moon and seen jungles, because at some time, 1,000,000 years ago, or 1,000,000,000 years ago, or 1,000,000,000 years from now, there may be jungles on the moon. Maybe that's when he was taken, was during that time period. Maybe it was in a parallel universe, a parallel dimension, which is exactly what is predicted by quantum physics now. When you talk about, the famous photon experiments that were done, and they had 2 slots, and they shined a light through one of the slots, and then they used a mirror. After the light came through the slot, they used a mirror to reflect it. And they were trying to determine if light was a wave or a particle. And they found out it was both. And they proved that you actually can travel backward in time, and that there actually are parallel universes.
How did that experiment prove that?
Because the observer, what the observer thought affected the outcome of the experiment. I can't explain that. Fred Alan Wolf's book, Parallel Universes, explains it in more detail. But that's what the experiment was designed to show, and that's what it showed, was that by being the observer, you create the universe. And so, in other words, you're back to the metaphysics again. Consensus reality is what we think of as living in. In other words, we all agree that this desk is here. Everybody agrees that it's here. That's consensus reality. Now, some people might see something else here, not a desk. That's their individual reality. And some people don't see the desk at all. That's their individual reality. Some of those people are in mental institutions because they're not within the consensus. But what quantum physicists will tell you is that consensus reality, we actually create reality by being the observer. And the fact that someone doesn't create that, isn't part of that creation of that reality, does not mean that their reality is any less real than ours is. Once again, I'm not a physicist, and I can't go into that too deeply, but that's what they're telling us now. So for the first time, since whoever it was that separated, during the Renaissance or whenever it was, that they separated the soul of man from the science, science is getting back to spirituality again. They're getting back to things metaphysical again. After hundreds and hundreds of years, we're coming back to that place again. And I think it's very interesting because, for years I've been involved with ufology and talking to ufologists, and they don't know about this physics. And now I've started talking to the physicists and find out that they don't know about UFOs. And now I've encountered, in going to conferences and stuff, I've encountered a lot of New Age people who've been studying metaphysics, spiritual people who are coming at it from an entirely different direction. And they're saying exactly the same thing that the physicists are saying, and that the ufologists are finding by studying the data. And where it all comes together for me is the ability to warp space-time, whether you do it with a machine or whether you do it with your mind. There is an ability to do it, and there is an ability to travel from one parallel universe to the other, whether it means going to a distant star. And, Carl Sagan and other people have said for years, well, these things can't possibly be from some other planet because it's just too far away, and that you can only travel up to the speed of light, and that's as fast as you can travel, and so they can't be from a 1,000 light years away because it just takes too long to get here, and so you can't explain how there could be, as Jacques Vallée says, 3 million landings. It just didn't work. But I think that that's completely irrelevant. It's an irrelevant argument if you're able to warp space-time, because you can travel instantly. And we may look at that distant star and say, well, there isn't any life there. See, we can tell. There's too much radiation, couldn't be any life there. But what we're seeing it, if it's 1,000 light years away, we're seeing it 1,000 years ago. And we're seeing it in our own three-dimensional universe, not in some other parallel universe. So when people talk about meeting someone from Venus or Saturn, maybe they're not as flaky as you might think. Maybe they did meet someone from Venus, but maybe it just isn't the same Venus that we look at when we go outside and look up. The one that's 800 degrees on the surface and melts lead and has an atmosphere of sulfuric acid. Maybe that's not the Venus that they're talking about.
So, it is, in essence, then, what's being constructed here is that there are all these other dimensional realities that are operating as though maybe we're, I'm sure it goes down to a singular dimensional reality. We simply have raised ourselves up to, say, a third into fourth dimensional reality, and we're probably at this point moving into a higher dimensional consciousness of reality.
Well, once again, this is something...
But all these things are occurring at the same point?
This is something that I've been told. This is not something that I can prove or anything else. But this is what people are told when they meet these beings aboard these UFOs. And a lot of people are being taught a lot of stuff. Most of them know they have a lot of information in their heads, but they don't have access to it. You know, they're not even given access to their own memories of the experience most of the time. And they certainly are not given access to all that information that's been put in there. They know they have it. They know they're going to use it at some time in the future. They can feel that. They know it's important. They know they're going to be able to access it at some time in the future. They believe it's some job that they're supposed to do, but they don't know what the information is. And part of that information may be to help us make this transition that they're talking about that we're going to have to make. I don't have the information either. All I know is that it's exciting to me that quantum physics is now predicting the same sorts of things that we're hearing from the people aboard the UFOs, the same sorts of things that people have been telling us, the metaphysical people have been telling us for centuries. There is some sort of a connection there.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's why I say, when we do things like refuse to look at part of the data, I think we're making a mistake because we're arbitrarily preventing ourselves from finding some answers by doing that.
Yeah, we're limiting our ability to understand.
We have been limiting our own ability arbitrarily, putting restrictions on our thinking.
There's a void of understanding in our research, and I think that that void of understanding is because that our concept of reality is extremely limited. And what I mean by that is, right now there's a new paradigm in science, and for that matter religion, that is happening. Science and religion are in the process of coming together. And they're basically two disciplines that are trying to understand God's universe, if you will, but they've been going down parallel paths and they don't agree. But those lines are now about to converge together. And the new paradigm in science has to do with some research that's happened in the last 10 to 15 years about how our mind actually perceives the reality around us and what is the nature of that reality. The first thing we have to understand about our reality is, how does our mind get the data from that reality? And basically it gets it through our senses. So we need to understand how our senses relay that information to the brain. And what Carl Prybram and other researchers have discovered is that it does it in the form of wave energy. That the brain is not a linear filing cabinet like we originally thought, that it is in fact a hologram of information. That all of our memories are stored by the interference patterns of wave electromagnetic energy coming from all of our neurons in the brain. And that's really how the information is stored, not little on and off registers like in a computer. Okay, if that's the case, then basically we're perceiving our reality around us by perceiving it as wave energy. That's how our brain understands it. But yet it comes out to us to be physically hard, real, solid matter, when in fact the information we're receiving about it isn't. If you examine reality itself, meaning physical reality, quantum physics kind of stuff, what our scientists have also found out is that basically we've always had the assumption that the atom was made up of pure energy. We just didn't know what that pure energy was or how it acted. So we've been tearing the atom apart for many years to try and understand its principles. What has finally happened now is that we've broken the atom down into small enough pieces where we're left with particles breaking apart into nothingness. They're dissolving into an energy that we still don't know what it is. And at the same time, we are finding out that on that level, that lowest of quantum levels that we're achieving now, that the thoughts of the experimenters are influencing the particles on that level, so that consciousness is interacting with matter on that quantum level. Now, we know that all matter is made up of pure energy, and it is just pure energy that is acting like matter. It is a slower, denser, maybe, that's the right way to put it, form of light, okay? And everything in the universe is made up of that very same thing. Now we have our senses that are taking something that appears to be solid but's really wave energy and interpreting it into our mind and memory and into our consciousness, for that matter, as wave energy. So what we have, the new view of the universe essentially is that we're dealing with ourselves, our bodies, the earth around us, the light that shines on us is all wave energy, period. That there really is no solidity to anything, it just appears to be acting that way according to how our senses interpret it. Now, what happens is, this is called the holographic model of the universe. Basically, the universe is acting as a gigantic hologram as well. Everything is a projection out of this pure energy, including our consciousness. Therefore, in a philosophical sense, everything is one. Everything comes out of the same thing, everything is a part of the same thing. And in the book, The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot, which is a fabulous book, everybody in the whole universe should read it. David Bohm, the physicist who came up with the holographic model of physical matter, uses the analogy that we are no more separate from everything else in the universe than the different streams of water coming from a fountain. The different streams are all coming from the same body of water, just acting as different streams. And that everything in the universe, including our consciousness, is that way. Now, what does that have to do with the aliens? Well, what it has to do with is that essentially our consciousness is interacting with everything. In fact, maybe physical reality as we know it really is solidified consciousness, or frozen thought, if you will. And that this energy of which everything is made up of is pure consciousness. And all of this consciousness combined together is the creator of the universe in religious terminology. So you can see where science and religion are now crossing lines, because their understandings all of a sudden are becoming the same, just using different words. Well, the aliens are just as much a part of this whole thing as we are. They're not separate from the universe. They're not separate from this quantum soup that everything bubbles out of. And their ability to manipulate our consciousness seems to be very profound. Well, when we come to an understanding of this new paradigm of the universe, telepathic communication, telekinesis, any of the mind over matter phenomenon that we're familiar with, including teleportation and astral travel and all that kind of stuff, is easily defined within a universe that is made of pure energy and consciousness is moving that. It would be no big deal to look forward or backward in time, because all of those things are amorphously connected together as one giant matrix. Well, we seem to be dismally unaware of these concepts at this point, unless you've studied, Zen and Tibetan philosophies, and some of the more of the Aboriginal cultures have been talking about this for a long time. Even the Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Lutherans, all of those religions have aspects of the holographic universe written into their doctrines. They just are not necessarily recognizing them as such. But things like, if you pray for something, it'll happen. Well, that's the same thing as saying, well, if you meditate on something, it's going to happen. And that is by having your prayers answered, you're essentially connecting your consciousness with the overall consciousness of the universe and saying, I need this scenario, and then therefore out of it, it manifests for you. That is a holographic universe concept, and it is no more mysterious, than the quantum physics that we study.
There are a lot of different theories about where we came from. Zechariah Sitchin, for instance, says that something like 450,000 years ago, some people came from another planet here, and they tampered with the genes of the primitive creatures, the Australopithecus or whatever, tampered with their genes and made Cro-Magnon man. And so suddenly here we were. Suddenly we were just full-fledged human beings with all of our modern abilities and everything like that. It's interesting to think about because we're destroying this planet now. Part of the reason, the major reason in my view that we're destroying it is because of greed. People are too greedy not to recycle. I mean, too greedy to recycle. They're too greedy to want to stop building all these weapons, the nuclear weapons and stuff. We could get all of our power from the sun, but nevertheless we're building nuclear power plants which pollute the earth, and this is just symptomatic of the way we do everything. Now, where did that greed come from? Well, back when we were, if you want to call us cavemen, maybe you could call us that, the person who was the greediest, the guy who could gather the most roots and berries and kill the most animals and take the most women for himself, this is the guy whose genes were likely to be passed on. And so we evolved, so where greed was good, that was a good survival characteristic. Now somebody comes down, injects intelligence into us, this tremendous technology blossoms on the planet, and we develop this high civilization that we have, and along with it comes all the technological problems of nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, all sorts of other things that we're doing. Now we're tampering with genes, we're actually creating creatures, and God only knows what they're going to do when they let them loose in the environment. There are a million things that we're doing that are ruining this planet. We're destroying the ozone layer with refrigerant gases. We've created global warming, acid rain, we're polluting our oceans, we're killing 3 species of life every day. It's going to get to a point very soon where if we destroy all the ozone, no life can exist here because we won't be able to stay here even if we stay indoors and don't. We're not just talking about skin cancer and what do you call the
glaucoma,
cataracts caused by ultraviolet radiation, but we're talking about not being able to grow food crops. We won't be able to survive at all. And this is happening very quickly, a lot quicker than most people think. So if you're these people who came here and created us in the first place by tampering with our genes, just assuming that this is a scenario that really happened, and you're up there and you're looking down at this planet, what you see down here is it looks like we have 2 main purposes in life. One is to destroy our habitat and all the other creatures that exist here, and the other is to kill each other like we're doing in Bosnia and so forth. It's just insanity how we live down here. And so the way I see it is those people would have about 3 choices. One is they could just allow us to go ahead and destroy everything. 2 is they could destroy us, as legends say they've tried to do in the past. They could destroy us and let everything else survive, all the other creatures. Or 3 is they could fix us. They could come back down and tamper with our genes again and get rid of that greed. It's interesting to me that a lot of the abductees, all of them that I've talked to, without exception, and I've talked to scores of them, the ones who I have asked, now I haven't asked them all this question, but the ones who I have asked, when I ask them, do you consider yourself an environmentalist, they say yes. Do you consider yourself a human rights advocate, they say yes. Do you consider yourself an anti-nuclear advocate, they say yes. But they didn't before they had these experiences, not necessarily. I mean, some of them may have and some may not have, but it seems that there's a widespread systematic program going on to abduct people. The Roper report, according to that, maybe 3.5, maybe 5 million Americans have been at some time. And what we find is that they're having a socio-political impact on us. They're changing the way we think. David Jacobs' book, Secret Life, He talks about the staring procedure that's done. It's one of the procedures during a standard abduction. They get up close to you and they stare at you. The people feel that information is being taken out of their minds and that information is being put in their minds during this procedure.
Right. In the classic scenario, there is a smaller being and a taller being. They look different, but they're in the same family, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And the smaller beings are more of assistants, helpers, I don't know how you would say it, workers. They get the person out of bed, they get the person's clothes off, they get the person on the table. They will oftentimes do the examination. Then a taller being comes in, and he does more specialized procedures. One of them is coming up to an abductee and staring very, 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 very deeply into his eyes from a distance of an inch.
Nose to nose.
Nose to nose, touching forehead.
Nose to no nose.
Nose to no nose. That's exactly right. Most people will say at that time that they feel that memories are being looked at, or data is being extracted in some way. He might evoke certain emotions in them. One might be attachment, love, bonding for them. There might be even certain sexual arousal techniques involved here, which can be angering and humiliating. There might be just straight fear. We've seen this, where they just suddenly get a sense of enormous, extreme, panicky fear while he's there, and then he pulls away and the fear is gone. We don't exactly know how these procedures are accomplished. We don't fully understand the reason for these mental procedures, but we do see it as a constant of the phenomenon, and almost everybody discusses it at one time or another.
And it appears that part of that information is stop ruining your planet, start loving each other unconditionally, and stop with the nuclear business. Now that's interesting again, because these are the same messages that the contactees were receiving back in the 50s. People laughed at them. They thought they were charlatans and they thought they were crazies, and so they didn't pay enough attention to them. And that's when we started having mass abductions. It was about that same time. It's interesting about the nuclear, stop with the nuclear business, because, you know, when we set one of those firecrackers off, it wasn't any time at all till we had Kenneth Arnold's UFO sighting. And, well, World War II, we had Foo Fighters. We had activity. These things were flying around the planes and so forth. But the Roswell crash happened right near the only base that had nuclear weapons in the world.
Yeah, strike capability.
Right near there. And so that's interesting, too. And I have heard from people who say they've been contacted that they have tried to explain that when a nuclear blast, when we set off a nuclear bomb, we talked earlier about the time not being linear. When we set off one of those blasts, that electromagnetic pulse that it gives off, the thing that causes all electronic gear to go haywire and stop working, which is one of the things that our weapons systems are designed around, is that pulse. What I've heard from contactees is that they're told that pulse goes throughout time and it doesn't just destroy a 5-mile crater out in Nevada somewhere where there aren't any people. It destroys things throughout time, throughout the universe. And so every time we set one of those things off, it isn't just messing things up here, it's messing things up everywhere. And I believe it. I mean, it's possible. If you think in terms of parallel universes, it's possible we're doing untold damage.
The mere existence of alien spacecraft should not be considered a matter of national security. As a matter of fact, at the point we're now at, it's a matter of national insecurity that the government feels it has to lie to its citizens.
There is definitely government involvement in abductions. There's government involvement in the subject at least since 1947, when they started the cover-up after the Roswell crash, and probably even before that. I think they started covering things up back during World War II. The Foo Fighters, I think, really worried some people big time, and I think that's maybe when the cover-up really started. And they've been covering up the abductions, and they appear to me to have been influencing the way we think of things, the way we think of these abductions with the Greys and people being sort of like tortured. I mean, people are just subjected to awful operations on their bodies without their consent, and their babies are stolen and so forth. That's prevalent in the United States, but it isn't anywhere else on this planet. Most other countries don't have much of that going on at all.
Much of the hybridization program or the reproductive experiments, you mean?
Yeah, well, the whole Gray scenario.
Oh, okay.
And so that indicates to me that part of that might be something that our government, elements of the government, are trying to foster and cultivate. For what reason, I have no idea. But I've had lots of people, lots of ufologists have suggested to me that may be part of our U.S. government program. I don't have any idea whether that's true or not, or why it would be true, but there have been many cases where people who have undergone abductions have encountered U.S. military personnel. William Hamilton will tell you about some of these. Leah Haley, you mentioned, will tell you about them. And Livingston is now looking into the electronic surveillance and electronic countermeasures type weaponry, non-lethal weaponry that our government has, and she thinks maybe some of these abductions could be staged. Richard Boylan has talked about he believes that some of these could be staged. In fact, he even talks about people wearing little alien suits, and there's a lot of terrestrial type technology that's used. Ordinary hypodermics, steroid shots are given to people. They're drugged. They're chloroform type things are used on them. They're subjected to lights and then symbols and then lights, to brainwashing. Ordinary brainwashing techniques are used. Some of them have been held at gunpoint and threatened. So you always have the black mystery helicopters involved, and people are followed, their phones are tapped. I think my phone's probably been tapped even. And sometimes, apparently, whoever's doing it makes little noises just so you'll know, because they don't have to do that. I mean, they don't have to make any noises, but sometimes at strategic points in a conversation you'll hear beeps or something, as if they're trying to tell you, well, we're listening, so you be careful, So yeah, there's a lot of government involvement.
Speaking from experience, I can only say this for sure. There are humans who monitor abductees, who have interrogated abductees, who have abducted abductees, and either through drugs or electronic controls made them vulnerable to questioning and then tried to erase most memory of the event. And usually there are physical after effects. There's a grogginess, there's sometimes a nausea. It's sometimes very physically there after the event happens. Whether they're involved actively with the aliens in doing this or with a group of aliens, we theorize because we get reports of, and ourselves see, alien entities with the military people. But to what extent they are cooperative or coercive, we don't know. ETs have said they control the military in some instances. We don't know if that's true or not. They lie.
But they're replicating the technologies the aliens are using
to
some degree.
Right. It seems to me that they began monitoring, when they became aware of this, obviously they began monitoring abduction activity. I have one case in my new book, Taken, that goes back to 1954, where military sequestered an entire family on a farm for 4 days after they had had alien encounters on the farm. So we know they were doing it at least that far back. It seems to me that they worked very hard, scrambled very hard to try to duplicate the technology, not only the technology for craft and the technology of other sorts, but also the mind control technology. And I think they've done pretty well in catching up enough to do some terrible things with this technology. They may think they're doing it for national security purposes to glean information that's necessary, but I know to a person, if any government agency really involved in this wanted our information from any abductees, every one of them would be happy to offer it without being abducted, drugged, and threatened. We would give the information. They just don't want us to know they're taking it. So.
Okay, so essentially what you're saying is that what their involvement is trying to determine what the alien agenda is.
That's my assumption, Tom.
Yeah.
They're not telling me what their agenda is, but from everything they've done that we've seen them do, it seems that they're the only, and the mindset we know from the military anyway is, how do we get the upper hand in a situation that could be potentially dangerous? And obviously this one is.
Yeah.
So that's the goal toward which information would be gathered.
Yeah.
And I don't think they have the upper hand.
I've talked to Carla and Leah both, and I've talked to other people, and they don't know why it's being done. And I don't know why it's being done. I do know, Michael Lindemann talks about what he calls meta levers. Something that's this huge and it has this power over the popular mind can be used as a lever, a political lever, to wield enormous power. Imagine Ronald Reagan, many times mentioned during his presidency. Imagine what would happen if we had a common enemy from outer space. Imagine how quickly we would give up our national disputes and become one people. You've heard a lot recently about the New World Order. A lot of people say that's a one-world government. Some people think that's a horrible thing. Some people think it's a wonderful thing. Some people think that it's part of prophecy, and that it is going to happen, and it must happen at some time in the future.
Yeah,
I think it's
for Christ to return.
For Christ to return. Yeah. I think it's probably inevitable that it will eventually happen, simply because our world is shrinking due to the computers, and we now have the
global brain kind of.
Yeah, we now have such good transportation and communication that national barriers are falling anyway. The banking industry is taking over the whole planet is going to get to where you can use a credit card to buy something from anywhere. Now we have computers that are very soon going to be able to have universal translation capability, so that you can pick up the telephone and talk to someone in New Delhi, and even though he's speaking his language and you're speaking yours, you can have communication. So I think it probably will happen eventually. Everybody will have a unique identifier, which the fundamentalist Christians will tell you is the mark of the beast. The universal price code might be used for that. And if that's the case, UFOs might be one of the meta levers that is used, as Lindemann says, that is used to sort of pry social mores into a different direction. But I don't know. I mean, other people have speculated that could be true. There are lots of other things that people have speculated, why the government's involved. Don Ware says that he believes there is a widespread systematic program in place of government education of the people in regards to UFOs and alien intervention.
I think there is a long-term government covert educational program concerning UFOs or our alien visitors. I think we're being fed a great deal of information through many, many different processes in ways that won't frighten us, that won't have an adverse impact on the normal course of human events, mostly through fiction. And, of course, Star Trek being the most notable series that I think for, 30 years now or so has been teaching us about various aspects of what I call the larger reality, how things really work out there in the rest of the galaxy. I think that things like Carl Sagan's articles in Parade magazine are reaching many, many millions of people. The one titled, "Are They Coming For Us?" I think is very cleverly written. It's not only highly educational concerning the UFO abduction phenomenon, but it's designed to cause us to accept one of two ideas, either that millions of Americans are hallucinating the same onboard experience, or it's really happening. And people read that article, and because of some of the statements he makes with question marks behind them, they think that, well, Sagan thinks it's all hallucination, but that's not what he says. I think he's trying to make us think and come to our own realization in our own time that it's not all hallucination, it's really happening.
You see commercials on TV now that show aliens. There was a Camel cigarette ad that said it had a picture of an alien and it says "they're here" or something like that, and it didn't say anything about cigarettes or smoking. Now, why is that? Unless there is an education program that's being funneled through those channels. You watch the X-Files on TV, and you see little facts that appear to be injected into the story that do not advance the story. Now, as a writer, I know that you don't put anything in there if it doesn't advance the story. And if there is something in there that doesn't advance the story, you take it out. But these are little things that are injected in there that don't advance the story, and they have to do with aliens, UFOs, and so forth. And this, you could speculate, a lot of people swear up and down that Close Encounters, Star Wars, all these E.T., all these big blockbuster movies were actually partly funded by the government and were overseen. There was an intelligence agent on the set of The Day the Earth Stood Still and so forth. Well, part of that makes sense because if we just found out back in 1947 during the Roswell crash that there were aliens coming here and that they were going to soon make themselves known and so forth, the first thing we would do would be to study all the social and political and economic and religious implications of all those things. And it's pretty frightening when you really think about it. If a UFO were to land, a flying saucer were to land on the White House lawn tomorrow, and Tom Brokaw and Dan Rather and Peter Jennings and all those people, Bernie Shaw, were there with their cameras rolling, so that the whole world could see, that this was really true and have absolute proof. You and I know that there are UFOs because we've studied them. The majority of the population isn't sure. So if these people were suddenly had their noses rubbed in it like that, imagine what would happen. Probably the very next day, 50% of the American population would not go to work. They'd sit home and watch TV to see what the aliens were doing. That tiny little fact alone, regardless of all the other, that's just the tip top of a huge iceberg. But that tiny little fact alone could throw the entire world economy into a tailspin. Because if half the people didn't go to work, the stock market would go crazy. And then you have people speculating, well, weapons delivery systems are just outmoded now because we've got this flying saucer. It can go 40,000 miles an hour. It can instantaneously disappear. So, the stock of the companies that make the F-111s and all those, that's not the stock of the companies that make the stealth fighter would probably plummet. Bell Telephone stock would probably plummet because we have better communications now. You have all these different implications. It could start religious wars. People, when their religion is threatened, and it would be, I think, in many cases, people get pretty desperate sometimes. You'd have politicians trying to grab power, trying to be the first to make the treaties with the aliens, and so that they'd get all the technology and they'd have the power and they'd be in favor. And
but that scenario doesn't seem to be occurring. It seems to be,
no. But what I was getting at is,
if that were to occur,
but that studies.
But if you look at UFO research, or that at least the written data, or talk to researchers and so forth. It's not going to happen that way. It would have happened that way already if that were.
Well,
maybe it has.
That's where I'm getting to.
But, yeah, okay.
That's where I'm getting to. If this happened, this Roswell thing happened in '47, and certain top people in our government were confronted with this very thing, the first thing they would have done was to study those implications. The second thing they would have done was to come up with a plan to prevent this from happening. You know, they'd already had this War of the Worlds thing in 1938, and it just about sent the whole country into panic, and it was just for fun. I mean, Orson Welles did it for fun. And so they were scared about this stuff. We just came out of World War II, and everybody was real crazy about secrecy and protection, national protection and national security and all this stuff anyway. Interestingly enough, the CIA and the Air Force were begun 3 weeks after the Roswell crash.
Yeah, from OSI.
And the Director of Central Intelligence became, I mean, that's what his title was at that point in time. And so they had the perfect environment to start a secrecy campaign. You got the Robertson panel, which said, I think it was in '53, said that even though these craft do not present any threat to the national security, the people's belief in them does,
yeah.
And they said that it should be debunked and so forth, and it has been debunked ever since. So it's possible that a program was set in place then and has been evolving ever since of secrecy and intervention. There are many cases where people have been, first of all, they've been told, you're crazy. No, first of all, they've been told you didn't see anything, it was just a star or a swamp gas or whatever. If they don't buy that, then they're told, you're crazy, it's, you know, you need mental health. If they don't buy that, then they're told, don't say anyone to this, it's a matter of national security, and if you say anyone to this, you're going to be in some big, big trouble. Mm-hmm. If they don't buy that, sometimes those people have disappeared or been found in the desert, like James McDonald, who supposedly committed suicide. It's still, up for grabs whether he did or not.
Yeah, Forrestal as well is another.
James Forrestal, yeah. They said he jumped out a window, but now we think maybe he was pushed.
Yeah.
So, there is some evidence to show that there has been this program in place, and maybe they've gone to other extremes too to influence. The CIA and other intelligence agencies we know have done terrible things throughout the world to influence politics.
In a sense, the history of the CIA involvement is the history of global wars.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And they also have done things to our own citizens. They were involved in some of the drug testing on citizens. And we know that our military, we've tested our own soldiers with mustard gas. We've
nuclear weapons and
all sorts of stuff like that. So we know that people in our government are capable of doing this. And why would they not try to ameliorate the problem? Because in every study that's been done that I know of, when they've studied what happens when a higher technological civilization comes into contact with one that is inferior technologically, the inferior one always ceases to exist, either through being outright conquered by the other one or by being absorbed into it somehow. Just like the Native American culture, these people are still trying desperately to hold on to their heritage, and there's hardly anything left of it because people came from Europe and just wiped them out. And what they didn't wipe out has been absorbed into the European-type society. That's what we have here, and that's classic. It's happened throughout history. Anyone who studied what would happen when these UFOs came down with their high technology would have known instantly that this was going to happen to us, and they would have tried to ameliorate it. Any government would try to ameliorate it because governments are all about control. That's what governments are, is control of the people. They don't want to lose control of us, and so they would do anything in their power, I think, to keep their control. And it appears that maybe that's what they've done. So maybe that's why there's government involvement. Some people who have been abducted by...
It's more as a way to contain the information and disseminate it at their own rate.
Yeah. In other words,
That's a fair statement.
It isn't that they don't want us to know about UFOs. They know they can't keep it a secret forever.
Yeah.
What they don't want is for us to know too much too soon. And it appears that now they're running out of time. Either they've been told by the aliens, which is a rumor that's been going around the UFO community, or they have decided that a critical mass has been reached, as has been done with the environmental situation, for instance. So many people are interested now, so many people know things now, that they're never going to be able to go back and pull the wool over our eyes again. They've realized that the cover-up is obsolete, and so they're going to try. They're trying to educate us now. They want us to believe certain things, and they're going to try to get us to be educated the way they want us to be educated for their best interests, and maybe for our best interests. I don't want to say that the government cover-up is not in our best interest. It may very well be. It may be that the people who decided to do this back in the 40s were just as smart as the founders of our country when they wrote our Constitution. It could be that they did have our best interest in mind, and maybe they've done us a lot of good. I can't say that. I can't. And I can't also be against our government for something that a few people did. I mean, our government is not a monolithic thing that has a hive mentality and everybody in it thinks the same, because they don't. I believe that there are different factions within the government who are working against one another here. There seems to be some evidence that certain people in the government want this information to come out faster. Certain people want it to not come out at all. Certain people want it to come out slower. And they're kind of having a tug of war there, you know. Because sometimes real important stuff gets leaked out right in the press. And sometimes it's, you know, you go through the Freedom of Information process and you get page after page that's completely blacked out. So they're not all working together. And, of course, nobody in the government knows everything. It's all compartmentalized. Somebody knows a lot more than they're telling, and somebody else does, but they may not know even who each other are. And so there's no one place you can even go to find out these answers. We've had situations many times where, for instance, an FBI agent would arrest a CIA agent. It happens all the time. It happens with other agencies, too. And I don't know how many intelligence agencies there are in the government, but you've got, I could name off a dozen at least, and I'm sure there may be 100 different ones. And so we don't know which SWAT teams are taking who hostage, and it's an impossible mess to try to figure out. All I can say is the government is involved in the UFO question, in the abduction question. They know, somebody knows a lot more than they're telling us. See, most research funds either come from the government or they're controlled indirectly or directly by the government.
Through universities.
Most research scientists know this very well, and they're not going to touch this with a 10-foot pole because it means their livelihood. They also know that a lot of scientists have flat disappeared. They call it the brain drain. If you look in the back of Sidney Sheldon's book, The Doomsday Conspiracy, you'll see a whole long list of people who just simply either disappeared or were found murdered. Scientists, top scientists who were working on Star Wars. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons why mainstream science is not going to touch this subject. The government also, the cover-up also extends to the media. Have you ever wondered why, when someone sees a UFO in your hometown, let's say you have an abduction in a really bizarre case, and there's a lot of physical evidence and everything in your hometown. You might read it in your hometown newspaper. It might get into there. But do the wire services pick it up? No. You don't read about it in the LA Times or the New York Times or any other newspaper. Right as we speak, there are people videotaping UFOs in Mexico. Britt Elders has been down there a number of times. She made Messages of Destiny, and they're making a new movie now. The new movie contains clips from 700 videotapes that have been taken close up of UFOs in flight over Mexico since July 11, 1991. She told me a story about the CNN headquarters. There was a mass sighting right in front of the building. people had stopped their cars and they got out and laid on the hoods and were watching this thing overhead in broad daylight, and no one ever came out of that building to film it. So does that mean that those people simply weren't aware of it? I don't think so. Does the fact that all this tremendous amount of activity is going on in Mexico and there's not one word about it in our press up here in the United States, does that mean that our reporters are no good? No, I don't think so. I think it means that the wire services have orders not to pick up these stories and circulate them. So, there's a reason for all these things. I don't think it's an artifact of the way we think of ourselves. I don't think it's because individual people are reluctant to admit that this is going on. I don't think that's why they don't believe in these things or anything like that. I don't think it's because they're too afraid to deal with it. I think it's because they've been conditioned over decades to ignore it and to laugh at it. And it's happened to me many times. People will laugh when I talk about UFOs. They'll laugh at it, and then later on they'll come up and say, I saw one of those. Mm-hmm. They don't want other people to know that they know. It's kind of like the emperor's clothes situation.
Yeah. Have you said anything you want to say?
Well, there are a couple things I want to say. You talked about proving an hypothesis. Mm-hmm. It should be tested. The hypothesis that I've come up with, well, first of all, it isn't my hypothesis. I mean, lots of other people have talked about this before I got onto this. I didn't know it when I came up with it, but as I researched the literature, I found that I'm not a pioneer in this. But it is testable. The fact that they're able to warp space-time is testable. And there are lots of simple methods of doing it. One of those is to just have some very accurate timepieces that are situated so that they cannot be affected by electromagnetic interference, connect them to computers, and have a grid network of them just like we do radar all over the world, or whatever little spot you want to test. And you should be able to track the temporal anomalies. Mm-hmm. George Knapp came back from Russia and told about Dr. Val, somebody over there, who had tested landing sites. He'd put identical quartz timepieces inside and outside, and the ones inside worked faster. They ran faster. Time was running faster. It's that simple to test that part of it. Some of the other parts of it, you could test, are these people coming from our future? It would be easy to test that, too. You could do all sorts of things. You could run computer projections of how we would look thousands of years in the future. Incidentally, some of those have already been done, and we look a little bit like those grays.
Yeah, I thought where they took the dinosaur and projected it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and came up with one that looks very much
it
like
looks
us
very
and
much
the gray type.
Yeah. And it looks a little bit like the reptilian aliens that some abductees have described. So you could there are a lot of ways to test this hypothesis. And in my book, I challenge scientists to do that. But once again, you're up against the problem of research funds. There are a few places where funds can be got now. There are a few millionaires now who are giving, the Bigelow Foundation, for instance, is funding some research. There is some research being funded through the Campaign for Human, not the campaign, the Human Potential Foundation.
Oh, yeah.
There are some places where research is being funded.
Fund for UFO research.
The fund, of course, the fund for UFO research. They're still few and far between, but they're out there. And of course, there are a lot of individuals like myself who do research on their own time with their own shoestring funds. So I think we are making some progress.
Yeah.
But the thought that I would like to leave people with is we need to put our heads together and work together rather than fighting each other over details as to whether the soil sample had 8 grams of water in it or 9 grams. that isn't important. And we're running out of time here. We don't have time to be fooling with minute details like that. And another thing is that this thing is bigger than all of us. People who want to try to run away from this, they can run away from it for a while, but they can't hide. It's going to find them, because it's going to involve everyone on this planet. I truly believe that. So I think that everybody needs to educate themselves about this subject and learn all they can about it, because I do think it's going to affect all of us. If we can prove that there's one UFO that's real, then we've proven all we need to there, the way I see it. It doesn't matter how many other millions of them are fakes or phonies, as long as one of them is real. And I think we need to have that attitude a little more. And so that's the purpose of Contact Forum, is to try to present information to everyone, whereas other magazines and newsletters have a tendency to cater to one specific group in order to sell the magazine. We're trying to have a newsletter for everyone to read and be exposed to it. You don't have to believe the information. I'm not asking anyone to believe these people's accounts. We're asking people to write their own accounts of their own personal experiences, or if they're not an experiencer of some sort, if they're not a contactee or an abductee, they can write accounts of how they treat experiences. If they're a therapist, how do you counsel them? If they're a ufologist, how do you study them? What have we found out from studying them? And this is information that all these people, I think, will be interested in. And it's been our experience that they are interested in finding out what the other half is doing. We've had good responses from all these different groups, that they all say we're doing a good thing here. Because even though they read their own journals, the New Agers read Connecting Link, the Nuts and Bolts people read the MUFON Journal, but both groups are reading our newsletter. So I'm hoping that we're doing what we set out to do.